The air in Sterling Vance's ranch house was sterile, a fortress built from immaculate order, cold silence, and suppressed grief. He ran a gloved finger along the mantelpiece, not a single speck of dust. The woman Maeve was efficient. It was the only term of the contract that mattered. He'd paid top dollar for a housekeeper, not a wife, and she delivered. But her quiet was a different kind of dust settling in corners he couldn't clean. He watched her from his study, a ghost in her own separate cabin, a woman who demanded nothing but her pay. He knew this kind of life. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. Yet her secrecy gnawed at him. This perfect order felt like a lie masking a life that wasn't above board. This house was once filled with laughter. Now its only sound was a clock counting the seconds since his world had ended. He would have control. He would have the truth. And that's why he followed her. He followed his mail-order housekeeper home, expecting to find a lover or a thief. But what he found would either shatter his broken soul or save it entirely. The fence posts of Sterling Vance's ranch stood like soldiers at attention, each one perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned, a testament to a man at war with the wild, chaotic heart of the West. His property line was a declaration, a stark border between meticulous control and the brutal, untamed landscape that bled away to the horizon. Here, the world was sterile. It was a kingdom built of immaculate order, cold silence, and the ever-present specter of suppressed grief. Sterling stood on his porch, the polished floorboards gleaming under the harsh afternoon sun. He ran a gloved finger along the railing. No dust. The contract was being fulfilled. The house was a pristine tomb, a monument to the life that no longer inhabited it. He had paid for order, a bulwark against the memories that threatened to storm his gates, phantom echoes of a child's laughter, the scent of a woman's perfume on the evening air. All gone, replaced by the scent of lye soap and lemon oil. He turned and walked inside his boots, making sharp, lonely sounds on the wood. The great room was a masterpiece of stillness. A book lay perfectly centered on the table. Chairs were tucked in with geometric precision. It was correct. It was clean. It was a void. And then she appeared in the doorway of his study, as silent as a shadow. Maeve O'Connell. "The pantry is stocked as requested, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was low and even betraying nothing. It held the quiet calm of a deep river, and he didn't know if it was peaceful or treacherous. He nodded, not looking at her directly, his gaze fixed on the ledger on his desk. "And the accounts for the week, ready for your review." He finally allowed his eyes to fall on her. She stood with a straight-backed stillness that was not subservience, but a kind of innate dignity. Her dress was simple, mended, neatly at the cuff. It was her hands that always snagged his attention. They were not the soft, pale hands of a housekeeper. They were strong, the knuckles slightly raw, the palms showing the faint, hardened signs of labor that had nothing to do with dusting shelves or polishing silver. A farmer's hands, he thought, a cold knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. Or worse. "Your pay?" he said, gesturing to a small stack of coins on the corner of his desk. She stepped forward, her gaze flickering over the coins before meeting his. There was no gratitude in her eyes, no relief, only a calm, unnerving assessment. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice steady. "If it is all the same to you, I would prefer to take half in coin and the other half in supplies." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Supplies? Yes, sir. Flour, lard, a sack of beans, some salted pork." The request was a stone thrown into the placid, controlled waters of his life. It was too much for one person. Far too much for a woman living alone in a one-room cabin at the edge of his spread. 1,000 poisoned possibilities bloomed in his mind. A lover hiding in the hills. A grub-line rider she was feeding on his dime. Her actions were not above board. Why, the word was sharp in accusation. Maeve did not flinch. "I prefer to manage my own accounts, sir. It is more efficient." Her excuse was a perfectly constructed wall, smooth and impenetrable. He stared at her, this woman with the name of a warrior queen and the secrets of a spy. He saw the quiet defiance in her posture, the unwavering strength in her gaze. She was a puzzle. He hadn't asked for a disruption to his sterile peace. He wanted to refuse to demand she take the coin and be done with it. But a darker, more compelling urge took hold. The need to know. Fine. He clipped his voice hard as iron. He made a note in his ledger, the scratch of the pen unnaturally loud in the silence. Arrange it with the cook. She gave a single curt nod. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Then she was gone, leaving him alone once more in his perfect empty house. He walked to the window and watched her small figure cross the dusty yard, heading toward the desolate cabin that was her only home here. She did not look back. A silver man in a silver house paying a silent queen her tribute of flour and beans. He didn't know her story and he didn't trust it. But he would. He would watch. He would wait. And he would uncover the truth of Maeve O'Connell, even if it meant tearing down the perfect, sterile world he had built to keep the ghosts at bay. The days that followed were a quiet, simmering fever. Sterling Vance found himself moving through the rigid order of his life, but his mind was a tangled mess of suspicion. His focus, once a sharp and unwavering tool, was now fixed on the woman in the cabin at the edge of his world. Maeve O'Connell. A ghost who left behind the scent of lemon oil and the chill of a question unanswered. He took to watching her from the tall windows of his study. From this distance, she was a small, industrious figure, her movements economical and precise. He saw her rise with the dawn, a pale ribbon of smoke climbing from the chimney of her shabby cabin. He saw her mend a tear in a grain sack with thread she produced from a hidden pocket, her fingers working with a swift, practiced skill. He saw her gathering fallen branches for firewood, never taking more than what was dead, and on the ground a strange and scrupulous respect for the land that felt at odds with the thief he imagined her to be. Each act of simple, honest labor was a counterpoint to the growing darkness in his mind. The supplies she had taken, the flour, the lard, the salted pork, became an obsession. He spoke to his cook, an old, grizzled man named Cookie, whose loyalty was to the ranch, not its master's moods. The woman Sterling began his tone carefully neutral. The supplies she requested. She took the full measure. Cookie nodded, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Yes, sir, Mr. Vance. The whole lot. Tucked it away, neat as you please. Must be stocking up for a long winter, that one. Quiet thing. Works hard. A long winter. Or a long deception. The thought coiled in his gut, cold and reptilian. His grief was a vast, silent shadow, and he had come to realize that suspicion was the only light he allowed himself to see by. It gave him purpose. It gave his pain a target. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday under a sky the color of a faded bruise. It was her day off. Sterling was in the stables, the smell of horses and old leather, a small comfort when he saw her walking, not toward town, but toward the skeletal arms of a dead cottonwood that marked the western edge of his property. It was a place no one ever went. A place of nothing. He moved to the hayloft, the shadows concealing him, and raised his spyglass. The brass was cold against his eye. He found her a small figure standing patiently by the dead tree. A few minutes later, another figure appeared. A man on a buggy. Sterling's breath caught in his throat. It was Dr. Elias Croft, the town's physician, a man of science and standing. He was old, his back bent, but he moved with a quiet purpose. Sterling watched his knuckles white on the spyglass as the doctor spoke to Maeve. He couldn't hear the words, only see the shapes they made in the cold air. The doctor reached into his buggy and handed her a small cloth-wrapped package. A package. Medicine. A secret ailment. A love token from a man old enough to be her father. The sight of the doctor, The secretive meeting. The anonymous package, it was a potent poison poured directly into the wounds of his past. He remembered another doctor, another time, another woman. He remembered the useless reassurances and the quiet, creeping death that had followed. Illness was chaos. It was the one enemy his order and his money could not defeat. And Maeve was tangled in it. Her secrets were no longer just about food and coin. They were about life and death. He lowered the spyglass, his hands trembling with a cold, righteous fury. The dam of his control, so meticulously built, finally cracked. He would not stand by and watch another mystery unfold into a tragedy on his land. He would not be a passive observer to another woman's secrets. He would know. That evening, the world seemed to hold its breath. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the charged air, in the way the silence pressed against the windows of his great empty house. He did not eat. He did not read. He sat in his study, the ledger open before him, but he did not see the numbers. He saw only her face, calm and unreadable. He saw her strong, calloused hands. He saw the small cloth-wrapped package. Tomorrow was the day. She would leave again. But this time she would not be walking into a place of nothing. She would be walking into the light of his discovery. He moved his best horse into a thicket of aspen trees well before dawn. A predator in his own kingdom, his saddlebags stocked for a long ride. The sky began to lighten from inky black to a deep bruised purple, then to a soft dove gray. Just as the first rays of sun ignited the tops of the distant mesas, her cabin door opened. Maeve emerged, a heavy basket on her arm. She paused for a moment, looking out at the world as if tasting the air, then set off with that same steady, determined pace. She was walking away from his perfect, orderly world toward her secrets. And he was right behind her. The hunt had begun. Sterling Vance moved with the quiet competence of a man who knew the land is horse-stepping sure-footed through the broken country. He kept a safe distance, a hawk circling its prey, using the ridges and dry arroyos for cover. The trail left the familiar, orderly pasture land of his ranch far behind, snaking into a series of forgotten canyons where the rocks were the color of old blood and bone. This was her world. A place of secrets hidden from his sterile, sun-bleached kingdom. His mind was a forge hammering out theories, each one darker than the last. A lover, a grizzled prospector she kept in a hidden shack. A rendezvous with a gang of outlaws trading his supplies for a cut of their spoils. He painted her a villain in his mind, a grand and terrible portrait, because it was easier than facing the empty canvas of his own life. The righteous fire of his suspicion was a welcome warmth against the cold, hollow ache of his grief. It was a purpose, a mission. He tracked her for hours, deeper into a territory that grew more desolate with every mile. The sun beat down the heat, a physical weight. Finally, her trail led him to the crest of a low mesa, and he looked down upon his destination. It was not what he expected. Below him, nestled in a small dusty bowl of a valley, was a homestead. But it was a ruin, a skeleton picked clean by hardship. The roof of the main cabin sagged in the middle, a broken spine. A fence had collapsed into a tangle of gray-weathered wood. The fields were choked with weeds, and the only sound was the mournful cry of the wind whistling through a broken window pane. This was not a den of thieves. It was a monument to failure. Sterling dismounted, tethering his horse in a stand of junipers. A profound confusion began to war with his certainty. Why would she come here? What secret could possibly be worth protecting in a place so thoroughly abandoned by hope? He crept closer, his boots silent in the dust, until he was concealed behind the crumbling stone wall of what was once a corral. He settled in to watch, his jaw tight with anticipation. And then he heard it. It was not the low murmur of lovers, not the clink of stolen coin. It was a sound so alien in this desolate place, so out of context with his dark theories, that it struck him like a physical blow. Laughter. A child's laughter, thin and bright, cutting through the heavy silence. Sterling's blood ran cold. He peered over the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin door creaked open, and Maeve stepped into the yard, setting down her heavy basket. Before she could even straighten up, the door burst open again. A small boy, no older than 6, ran out and threw his arms around her legs, his face buried in the rough fabric of her skirt. He was followed by a girl a few years older, and then another smaller child who toddled out on unsteady legs. They were thin. Their clothes were a patchwork of mended rags. But their faces as they looked up at Maeve were alight with an adoration so pure and powerful, it was like looking into the sun. "Maeve, Maeve," the boy cried, his voice filled with a desperate joy. Sterling watched paralyzed as she knelt and opened her basket. She pulled out the sack of flour, the salted pork, the supplies from his own pantry. Then she drew out the small cloth-wrapped package from the doctor. She gave it to the oldest girl. For Samuel's cough, Maeve said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, stripped of its guarded formality. It was the voice of a mother. "A spoonful in warm water, just as we did before." The girl nodded and ran back inside. The truth did not dawn on Sterling. It crashed down upon him, an avalanche of shame that buried him completely. The calloused hands from working this sad patch of earth, the extra food, the secret meeting with the doctor, the name of a warrior queen and the quiet, fierce battle she was fighting all alone. It was not a den of thieves, it was an orphanage, a house of ghosts, children left behind by the same plague that had made his own house a tomb. The cold, hard certainty that had been his shield, his purpose, his righteous fire, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The anger, the suspicion, it all curdled into a shame so profound it buckled his knees, and he had to press a hand to the stone wall to keep from falling. He, Sterling Vance, who had sealed his heart in a marble vault of grief, had been hunting a woman who was single-handedly keeping other ghosts from the grave. He had followed her home expecting to find her sin. Instead, he had found her grace. He stayed hidden behind the wall, the setting sun casting his long, monstrous shadow over the yard where she played with the children. He had come here for a reckoning. And he had found one. The judgment was not for her. It was for him. What does a man do when he finally sees the truth, and the truth reveals him to be the monster he could not move forward? He could not go back. He could only watch as the light faded, his own soul lost in the twilight. He did not know how long he stayed hidden behind the crumbling wall, a statue carved from shame. Minutes bled into an hour. The sun, which had moments before been a harsh, accusatory eye, softened into the bruised purples and golds of twilight. He watched Maeve lead the children inside the sagging cabin. A single weak lantern flickered to life in the window, a tiny defiant star against the encroaching darkness. That star broke his paralysis. He stumbled back to his horse, moving like a man twice his age, his limbs heavy with a new and terrible weight. The ride home was a silent pilgrimage through his own failure. The landscape, which on his journey out had seemed a canvas for his dark theories, was now just land. Rock and dust and sky, all of it indifferent to the petty, vicious kingdom of suspicion he had built and ruled inside his own head. The only monster in these hills had been him. He returned to a house that had become a stranger. The immaculate order that had been his comfort was now his torment. The polished floorboards reflected a distorted, hollowed-out version of himself. The perfectly aligned books on the shelves seemed to mock his ignorance. He had curated a museum of his grief, a place where everything was in its right place except his own soul. He walked through the silent rooms, the echo of his footsteps a profane intrusion on the sacred silence he had once cherished. Now it was just emptiness, a beautiful hollow shell. He poured a whiskey, the amber liquid, a familiar promise of oblivion. He raised the glass to his lips but paused. He saw her face in his mind's eye, her calm dignity as she asked for flour and beans. He saw the children's faces alight with a joy that his money and his land could never purchase. With a ragged curse, he threw the glass against the stone hearth. It shattered the explosion of sound, a violation, the spray of whiskey, a stain against the perfect stone. It was the first disruption of his sterile order in 5 years. A war raged within him all through the sleepless night. He sat in his study, the ranch ledgers spread before him, the columns of profit and loss a meaningless scrawl. What was the value of 1,000 head of cattle against one child's cough in the night? What was the worth of his sprawling lands compared to the small broken-down kingdom she had built from love and sheer force of will? He owed her a debt. But how does a man apologize for a sin? He never spoke aloud. How do you offer a hand to someone when your own is caked in the dust of unjust suspicion? He could not offer her charity. He knew that much. A woman who could build a fortress of hope from ruins would not accept a rich man's pity. To do so would be to insult the very strength he now stood in awe of. It would be an act of power, and he had lorded his power over her in his mind for weeks. He would not do it in person. "So, what then, Sterling?" a voice whispered in his head. It sounded like his late wife Eleanor. "What do you do?" He looked around the room, his gaze falling on a small, leather-bound volume of poetry on the shelf. Eleanor's favorite. He pulled it down his fingers, tracing the gilded letters. She had been a woman of quiet, fierce compassion. She would have seen the truth of Maeve in an instant. She would not have hesitated. She would have simply helped. The idea came to him then not in a flash of divine inspiration, but as a slow, dawning realization. A plan that was not built on pity, but on pragmatism. A lie constructed around a core of profound truth. It had to be a contract, a partnership, a transaction just like their first one. It was the only language he was certain she would understand and respect. He spent the rest of the night at his desk, but this time he was not counting cattle. He was drafting documents, sketching maps, building a new kind of order from the chaos of his shame. He worked with the same meticulous precision he used to plan a cattle drive, but his purpose was entirely different. He was not protecting his wealth. He was trying to buy back a piece of his soul. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gray. Sterling did not feel tired. He felt a terrifying, fragile clarity. He rode out for the second time, the rising sun at his back. The air was clean, washed new by the night. He was not a hunter this time. He was not a predator. He was a supplicant, a man with a proposition. He rode toward her hidden homestead, the place he had desecrated with his suspicion. He carried no spyglass, only a roll of papers in his saddlebag, and a heart heavy with the terror of his own audacity. He was Sterling Vance, a man of wealth and power, about to offer a treaty to Maeve O'Connell, a silent queen in a kingdom of cast-offs. He was no longer hunting a villain. He was about to make a proposition to a woman of impossible strength. And for the first time in years, he was terrified she would say no. He rode toward the homestead, under the high, unforgiving sun. The second journey felt longer than the first, each hoofbeat a hammer blow against his hollowed-out conscience. When the sagging roof of the cabin came into view, he saw it not as a ruin, but as a stubborn fortress on the brink of siege. He saw the small details this time, a row of struggling cornstalks in a tilled patch of dirt, a child's doll made from a bundle of rags sitting on the porch step like a tiny heartbreaking sentry. This was not a place of failure. This was a battlefield, and he was the invading army. She must have heard him coming. As he drew near, the cabin door opened, and Maeve stepped out, wiping her hands on a threadbare apron. She did not wait for him on the porch. She walked to the broken gate of the corral, placing herself squarely between him and the house, a lioness guarding her den. Her face, once a mask of quiet efficiency, was now one of cold, protective fury. Her eyes, which he had mistaken for empty, blazed with a fire that could have forged steel. He dismounted slowly, the roll of papers in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. The silence stretched thick with unspoken accusations. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of all warmth. It was a flat, hard stone of a sound. "You are a long way from your house." It was not a question. It was a challenge. He had trespassed, and she was demanding to know his purpose. He held up the roll of papers, a flimsy shield. "I came to talk business, Miss O'Connell." A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, quickly suppressed. "Business? There is no business here. This is barren land." On the contrary, he began forcing his voice into the stiff, formal tone of a man discussing ledgers and property lines. He was hiding behind the language of the contract, the only language he knew how to speak to her. "My lawyers in the capital have reviewed the original land grants for this territory. This parcel," he said, gesturing vaguely at the dust and weeds around them, "falls within the legal boundaries of my property. It has, it seems, for some time." He let the lie hang in the air, a carefully crafted piece of fiction. He watched her absorb the information, saw her back straighten even further. He had just declared himself her landlord, her owner. The shame of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. "I see," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And have you come to evict us, Mr. Vance?" "No," he said quickly, perhaps too quickly. He cleared his throat and resumed his cold, businesslike tone. "I am expanding my winter grazing operations. The canyon to the east provides excellent shelter from the wind. I require a resident warden for this outpost. I am here to offer you the position." She stared at him, her eyes narrowing with sharp, intelligent suspicion. "A warden. For a pile of rocks and a broken-down shack, the shack will be repaired. The well will be deepened. The ranch requires a presence here, a formal one." He unrolled the papers, the sound of the crackling parchment unnaturally loud. "The position comes with a salary, substantially more than your current one. All supplies, food, lumber, medicine will be provided from the ranch's operational budget." He paused, bracing himself for the most delicate part of the lie. "Your duties?" He continued, his gaze fixed on the papers, unable to meet her eyes, would include the maintenance of the property and the full supervision and care of any and all current occupants. They would be considered for legal purposes wards of the Vance Ranch. He had done it. He had offered her a cage gilded with security. He had offered to legitimize her secret kingdom by conquering it. She was silent for a long time, her eyes searching his face, looking for the cracks in his story. He felt like a boy standing before a judge. Why, she finally asked, her voice a low, intense whisper. "Why this worthless piece of land, Mr. Vance? There is better grazing to the north. There is more water to the south. Why here?" He had prepared for this. "The canyon provides unique shelter from winter storms," he said, the lie feeling thin and brittle on his tongue. "It is a strategic decision for the health of my herd, not a sentimental one." He saw the refusal in her eyes. Her pride, a magnificent and terrible thing, would not let her accept this. It was too convenient, too easy. He saw the word no forming on her lips, a word that would damn them all. And then from inside the cabin came a sound that shattered the tense standoff. A child's cough, a thin, racking, painful sound. It was the sound of necessity, the sound of a life hanging in the balance. It was the sound of a queen realizing her kingdom was on the verge of starvation. Maeve's gaze faltered. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. The fight went out of her, her shoulders slumping for the first time since he had met her. She looked from him to the cabin door and back again. She was trapped. The terms, she said, her voice barely audible, the word, a surrender. They would be in writing relief, so powerful it almost dropped him to his knees, washed over him. "Of course," he said, his own voice hoarse. "A formal contract, to protect all parties. And the children, she said, her eyes now locking with his, holding a new, fierce warning. They are not to be interfered with. They stay with me, under my care. That is not negotiable. That is the primary function of the warden, he replied, nodding. The contract will state it explicitly. The treaty was signed in the silent air between them. The supplies were secured. He had won. He had saved them. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt absurdly formal. I will have my foreman deliver the first shipment tomorrow, and a building crew on Monday. He turned and walked back to his horse, his back exposed to her searching, suspicious gaze. He did not look back as he rode away. He had built them a fortress of lies to protect a fragile truth, but he was still on the outside looking in. The wagons arrived at dawn. They came laden with the architecture of a new world, fresh-cut pine that smelled of the high forests, kegs of nails, shingles for the roof, and sacks of grain that promised more than just a single meal. Sterling watched from a distant bluff as his foreman, a man of few words and immense capability, directed the crew. The air, once filled with the whispers of wind and profound solitude, now rang with the sharp, clean song of hammers on wood. It was the sound of resurrection, loud and clumsy and full of masculine energy. It was the sound of his will being imposed upon her quiet, desperate kingdom. And he hated it. He hated it, and he craved it. He had expected to feel a sense of satisfaction, the clean pleasure of a problem being solved. Instead, a deep anxiety gnawed at him. He watched the cabin, saw the pale, small faces of the children peering out the dirty window, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder at the noisy invasion. He saw Maeve standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, a lone, still figure in a whirlwind of activity. She was not supervising. She was enduring. He was their benefactor, their conqueror, their landlord. He was anything and everything but the one thing he longed to be forgiven. He forced himself to ride down late that morning, playing the part of the inspecting proprietor. The lie was his shield, the contract his armor. He dismounted his boots, sinking into a chaos of wood shavings and discarded nails. The foreman tipped his hat. "Mornin', Mr. Vance. Comin' along nicely. Should have the new roof sealed before the next rain." Good Sterling said, his voice clipped. He walked toward the cabin, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Maeve met him at the steps. Today her face was not hostile, but a mask of polite, impenetrable neutrality. She had accepted the terms. She would honor the contract. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she said. "Miss O'Connell." He gestured toward the new stack of lumber. "The materials are satisfactory, I trust. They are of the finest quality," she replied, her voice even. "The men are good workers." The conversation was a desert, dry and barren. They were two strangers discussing a business transaction while a universe of unspoken truth churned between them. He wanted to say something, anything that was real. "I know. I am sorry. Let me help." But the words were locked behind his teeth, prisoners of his own pride. It was a child who broke the standoff. The little boy Samuel, the one whose cough had sealed their pact, slipped past Maeve and stood at the bottom of the steps, staring up at Sterling. He was small and impossibly fragile, his eyes holding a solemn curiosity that knew nothing of contracts or shame. He clutched something in his fist. Slowly, he opened his hand. In his palm lay a small, perfectly smooth river stone gray with a single white stripe running through it. He held it out to Sterling, a gift, an offering, a simple, devastating treaty that asked for nothing in return. Sterling froze. Every instinct he had screamed at him to recoil, to retreat back into the safety of his cold formality. This was the chaos he had fled, the unpredictable, undefended territory of a child's heart. His hands, which could command 100 men and 1,000 acres, felt clumsy and useless. Slowly, awkwardly, he knelt down, his knee cracking in protest. He reached out a gloved hand and gently took the stone. It was cool and solid in his palm. "Thank you." He managed to rasp the words, feeling foreign and rough in his throat. The boy gave him a shy, gap-toothed smile and then scurried back to hide behind Maeve's skirt. Sterling stood up, the small stone clutched in his hand. He looked at Maeve, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. The impenetrable wall of her neutrality had a crack in it. It was not gratitude. It was a kind of cautious surprise. She had just seen the man behind the mask as startled and out of his depth as she was. She broke the silence. "The men will be stopping for their midday meal soon, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice softer now. "There is fresh stew, if you care to join them." The offer was a bridge thrown across the chasm between them. It was not an invitation into her heart, but it was an invitation onto her porch. He knew he should refuse ride back to his own empty dining room and his cold, solitary meal. "I would," he heard himself say. "Thank you." He sat on a newly constructed bench, the plate of stew warm on his lap. It was a simple meal, the salt pork and beans he had provided mixed with wild onions and herbs she had gathered herself. It was the taste of their partnership, the taste of a truce. The sounds of the children's hushed play drifted from inside the cabin. The rhythmic hammering of his crew was a steady beat in the background. The sun was warm on his face. And for the first time in 5 long years, the hollow ache in his chest eased just a little. He had come to impose his order, and instead he had been invited into her life-affirming chaos. He ate the stew, the simple warmth spreading through him, and felt the first thaw of a long and bitter winter. But as he finished and handed the empty plate back to Maeve, her polite, distant nod was a stark reminder. The treaty was signed. The supplies were secure, the walls were going up, but he was still an outsider, a king surveying a foreign land. He had built them a fortress, but the gates to its heart remained closed to him.